you very much, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I think the topic couldn't be more relevant geopolitically, economically, security-wise, in the face of the atrocious war of aggression that Putin's Russia is waging against Ukraine. I will not go into the technical detail of all the sanctions that the European Union has imposed over the last couple of days, because you are absolutely familiar with those, but I will try to be very brief, as you said, Chair, so that we have more time for a fruitful Q&A. Let me just first recall a couple of principles. When we built this sanctions package over the last month, because we started back last autumn 2021, we established a couple of guiding principles, namely that these sanctions needed to be extremely firm and tough to impose an economic and political cost on Russia. Secondly, that they need to be focused. In other words, to put it bluntly, that we need to hit them where it hurts. Thirdly, they need to be both economically and politically scalable. So we need to be in a position to do more if the situation on the ground requires it. I'll come to that later, because we are still in a position to do significantly more. And at the same time, we need to be balanced. So we need to look at sanctions from a perspective of minimizing the adverse effects on the European Union and on our own economic operators. And last but not least, we need to coordinate extremely well with our partners, not only, of course, in the G7, but also beyond. And I think that's what we have done, quote unquote, successfully, if you can call something like sanctions a success, over the last weeks and months. A very important underlying principle is, of course, sanctions are not an end in themselves, but they're part of a broader EU political strategy of the Union and its allies. So we impose sanctions. We're not doing that for the sake of the sanctions per se, but we do doing this to really drive up the cost for Russia, to drive up the cost in Moscow. And I think when you look at the unprecedented scope and the unprecedented unit these sanctions were designed and voted and implemented now. And as you were rightly saying in your introduction, not just on Russia, but also on Belarus, which we increasingly see, frankly, as an appendix to this war of aggression. Now, the sanctions are, of course, often criticized for being ineffective, but I think you just have to look at what is happening in the Russian Federation to see that they are very, very effective. First and foremost, of course, on the economic plane, the ruble is at a record low. Inflation is up. We have a massive increase in the interest rate beyond 20%. The stock market is closed, and according to our estimates, will remain closed. We have wiped out chunks of the value of a Russian enterprise. Former flagships are now trading as penny stocks internationally. We have created a serious liquidity problem for the Russian banking sector. Various daughters of Russian banks in the Union are already belly up. We have a bank run in Russia in all but name. And very, very importantly, because this is really unprecedented, these sanctions on the Russian central bank mean that the traditional handling of such serious structural economic crises by the country concerned doesn't work anymore, because the central bank has no means anymore to resort to its foreign exchange reserves as a buffer, and also cannot repatriate important foreign assets that it holds abroad. There's, of course, a wider knock-on effect in financial markets because Russian assets are thrown out of various indices, ETFs, investment funds, etc. We see a massive chilling effect already in trade and investment, in the sense that we actually, somewhat ironically, have a degree of over-compliance by international investors who are withdrawing from Russia, who are freezing their investment stock. Have very importantly a very interesting effect on commodity markets, in the sense that on the one hand, prices are up, also, of course, pushed by other measures like yesterday's U.S. oil embargo. But we also see a knock-on effect on oil deliveries, on LNG deliveries, on metal prices, etc. So the only, let's say, commodity transfer that is actually still pretending that there's something like business as usual is maybe somewhat ironically pipeline gas. So in short, Russia is basically at the brink of a technical default. It's been downgraded to junk, and it will face a very serious and prolonged economic recession in our view. Two more words on the economic side. You will have seen that beyond the financial sector, we very, very deliberately targeted sectorial sanctions on specific, let's say, goals. We've expanded the technology export sanctions in the field of energy, with a focus on refining technology, precisely to degrade Russia's technological base in this critical field and gradually wipe out a double-digit billion export revenue for the Russian regime over time. We have done the same in aviation, where the sectoral measures actually work fast than we would have predicted through the complete export ban on aviation goods, aircraft, spare parts, and what have you. And we also see an impact on other modes of transport, including shipping. Already, shipping is 1/3 down over the last 2 weeks. And that reflects the, let's say, principled approach that I mentioned before, that we need to hit them where it hurts, target our sanctions as much as that is possible. Third point in that, we, of course, not only targeting the economy or specific sectors, but also individuals. The individual asset freezes and travel bans are all sort of colloquially laughed about in the sanctions debate, but they are incredibly powerful measures. Let's not forget one thing: the Putin business model is basically built on the premise: make money in Russia and spend it abroad, have a good time abroad. The latter part doesn't work anymore for quite a few people, and more to come. Final point of this, we are in the process of significantly upgrading sanctions implementation, notably on these sanctions, precisely because they are so powerful and important. The seize and freeze task force that's been set up in the G7 context has started work together with the law enforcement agencies of member states. And again, I would not underestimate the impact that will have on the political calculus of certain individuals. Let me say a few things by way of a first conclusion. So what does that mean? First, we see that the sanctions bite in many ways faster and tougher than we expected. At the same time, we need to take a step back. We are not operating on the basis of the proverb "sanction a day keeps doctor away," but we need to take some time. If you can explain. We need to reflect that we had a really unprecedented moment in terms of using the European Union's economic clout here. So while we are prepared for more, and there is, given the military escalation of the ground, unfortunately, a need for more in the days and weeks to come, and we are prepared for that across sectors. We also need to realize, politically speaking, that we're in this for the long haul. So the sanctions that we impose are not one-offs, but they need to be sustainable. And at the same time, let's also be clear, we need to prepare for the impact that this will have on the global economy. We are not driving the Union together with our allies into the direction of a new sort of Cold War, economically speaking. I think that would be a mistake. But at the same time, again, let's keep in mind that these sanctions are not easy playing cards that you play according to the political conjecture of today, but this is something that will require a lot of political and economic stamina from our side as well. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you,
Michael. Sorry, one thing that I didn't say, we tried to have we had a couple of invitations for female speakers. I apologize for that. Normally, we always like to have men and women, and this time it was just in the last minute there was a drop-off, and I'm sorry about that. Sergei Guriev is one of the top Russian economists in the world. He's a full professor at Sciences Po, and I would like him to tell us his perception of the impact of the sanctions on the Russian economy. Sergei, please.
Thanks, Louis, for those kind words and for organizing this and event and for all you are doing on this very important front. Economists do have heart, and I would like to first and foremost start with my support to the Ukrainian people fighting for freedom, not only of their country, but also Russia. It's not Russia's war, it's Putin's war. And actually yesterday, together with belly dancer Mikhail Baryshnikov and writer Boris Akunin, will launch an important initiative called Through Russia, where we say that we are through Russia, we are against the war, and we will fundraise among Russians to support Ukrainian refugees. I think it's very important to understand that misleading to say that every Russian supports this war. We don't know exactly where public opinion is because Putin criminalized dissent, and I think even polls are now misleading in the sense that people don't want to pick up phone and say, I'm against the war, please put me in jail for 15 years. So it's a huge problem. Now talking about the economy, I think since I don't have much time, I would just say Russia is back to 1990 or 1991. I'm not able to be more precise because the situation is changing every day. So whether it's 1990 or 1991 is not clear. But if you think about Russian economy before the war, it was not growing already. It was stagnating. Income before the war were about 10% below in real terms its 2013 level. And that's why the excitement about Crimea was fading away. And that's why Putin thought, I need another Crimea. And of course, economic growth was not there exactly because of the system Putin has built, corruption, domination of the state, domination of politically connected businesses, isolation from the global economy, harassment of foreign investors. So that is what destroyed Russian economic growth. On the other hand, Russia had a very stable macroeconomic system. So this micro system was bad, but macro system was good. It's a bit different from Turkey. In Turkey, you have very competitive and sophisticated industrial conglomerates, banks, small and medium-sized enterprises, but disastrous macroeconomic management. In Russia, it's vice versa, where a central bank has moved to inflation targeting and flexible exchange rate, which weathered the 2014 shock really well. Central bank has built those reserves of $630 billion, depending on the day, depending on the exchange rate. It changes a little bit. And then you have fiscal rule, which balances the budget at $44 per barrel oil price. And then you have very low debt. Even after pandemic, Russian sovereign debt was at 20% of GDP. And so this is what prepared Mr. Putin's calculation that the war will not be too costly for him. And this is where he was surprised so badly with the sanctions on the Russian central bank. And then one of the things which happened, we understand now that Mr. Putin started this war without consulting too many people around him, including this whole economic team. And so the economic team is improvising, and some decisions they are making are definitely not well prepared. And so Russia is back in the way that Russia now has a black market for dollars. Yesterday, central bank actually outlawed Russians buying dollars. a prompt bank withdrawing large amounts of dollars from their bank account. A week ago, the central bank outlawed moving money cross-border, moving currency cross-border. So Russia is back to capital control, something that Russians forgot. How inconvenient it is to live with that. And finally, what is important, in addition to technological sanctions that again remind us late Soviet, there is also an exodus of foreign companies. Russians didn't have, Soviet citizens didn't have McDonald's until I think 88 or 89. Coca-Cola was not present in Russia, Pepsi-Cola was. And so when you think about all the Western services, products, technology, software, intermediate inputs, we are back to Soviet times. And that, of course, hurts Russian economic growth in longer term and destroys quality of life in longer term. But what hits Russians here and now, today, is the financial havoc. And so the dollar is becoming more expensive relative to the ruble. We don't know by how much. Official rate of ruble is about 30% below its pre-war level, but pre-war level was already below pre-escalation. And then on top of that, unofficial exchange rate is probably even further 20% weaker. And so when you adopt these numbers, you think about, yes, oligarchs are hit, yes, middle class lifestyle is destroyed, but ordinary Russians, poor Russians, are also feeling the hit, because if you have your income and you spend it on communal utilities, you spend it on food and you spend it on medicine, food is going to be much more expensive, and medicine will be 50% or 100% more expensive simply because of the depreciation. So everybody in Russia is hit, everybody's unhappy, and then Mr. Putin understands that and he's switching towards more and more repression, suppressing dissent. He just bans all independent media. He essentially criminalized any public opinion which disagrees with him, and he invested in riot police. So situation.
One question that you passed a little bit quickly, which is, only 1 minute because we have two more speakers, but
yeah.
In terms of not the long-term, medium-term damage, but the impact of the financial system sanctions and the probability of an actual collapse of the financial system, of the economy, is that what we have done enough to cause that? Is that the likely outcome, or is that a not unlikely? And what is your sense about the actual kind of financial crisis aspect?
So financial crisis is there. Russia's debt is now rated imminent default. Russian companies are really in trouble, and not just financially, because interest rates are higher. So businesses will not have access to cheap rubles as well, not just to dollars, but also to cheap rubles. And so the economy is in a big problem. And then the question is asked. Let me use another 30 seconds. The analogy which is used often in social media is you see a China cabinet. You see a cabinet where you see China being pots, cups, plates, by a pile of China fallen but stopped by a glass door. And so the analogy is when Russia reopens stock market and currency market and allows people to actually try to transact, the whole thing will fall and collapse. And so the question is often asked, okay, Russia closed the stock market. When it reopens stock market, which may actually take weeks, when it reopens the currency market, there will be a disastrous implication for financial system because all the banks will be underwater. If you're a bank who holds Russian assets, your assets will be devalued by a factor of 3, 4, 5. We don't even know how much. And so people ask me, and here I come to your which you make very clearly always, is when you open it, it falls down. So the question is, what are the plugs, what are the end games that Russian policymakers have in mind? They improvise now, but what is their game plan when they reopen the door? What will prevent China from falling down? And there are two things they hope for. And one is China, People's Republic of China. And so China has to be part of the solution. I'm very happy to see that Chancellor Scholz and President Macron talked to President Xi. And China is not very excited about this war. And China has to make sure that Russia doesn't think that China will be able to bail it out and provide all the inputs it needs. And then the other part of the solution is oil revenue. As I mentioned, Russian budget is based on the very low oil price relative to today's oil price. Now, the Russian budget will have a huge impact because that budget, that fiscal rule of $44 per barrel was based on the presumption that Russian economy will grow by 3%. Today, when recession is likely to be minus 10%, Russian budget has a huge hole and $44 per barrel will not be enough. But 100 or 120 may be enough. And in that sense, through sanctions, through oil embargo, through secondary sanctions, and through private boycott, which we already observed from oil companies and transportation companies, this is where Russia has to be hit if you want this China to actually fall apart or prevent Russia to reopen the door. But effectively, to today, financial crisis is there. It's just the door is closed. So we don't know what the negative capital Russian banks have. They have negative capital, but since the stock market doesn't function, the asset prices are not discussed. We don't know by how much. But I think sanctions have hit and hit painfully. But there are two other elements which need to be paid attention to: China and oil revenue.
In the mute. Perfect. Thank you, Sergey. It was super clear. Armin Steinbach is a very, very good person to have talking about this, because not only is he very fluent on the academic side of the law and of the economics, but he also has been actually on the policy side by working on the Ministry of Finance and Economics, Germany, and energy. So he has exact perfect set of skills to discuss what can we do, what are the options that we haven't explored and that we should explore. I mean, please go ahead, and thanks very much for being here as well.
Thank you very much for inviting me and being able to speak here. And I echo what Sergey said to you and Petros. I appreciate very much your effort and your role in this political situation. It's extremely important to maintain the political pressure as you do. It's really I admire your work on this. That said, I would like to focus on my introductory remark on two issues. The first, turning the view to the economic impact on the EU. Why this is important? Because the sanctions that we impose on Russia are also a function on the impact these sanctions have on the EU, and the political appetite and the economic potential of pursuing further sanctions depends on this impact. And secondly, I briefly want to sketch out a few more sanctions that could be pursued. And Michael said in his initial remarks, sanctions must be scalable. Yes, that's true. But maybe some more sanctions can actually be pursued. So on the economic impact, we know all the main problems. The main problem is the dependence from Russia on certain commodities, and especially on fossil energy. 40% EU gas imports coming from Russia, with quite some diversity. Germany importing 50%, France only 25%, and the Netherlands only 10%. So we have a quite diversity between EU member states in depending on Russia, which also makes it more difficult on the EU level to come up with one voice regarding on that frontier. Then oil imports 27% coming from Russia, coal 46% from Russia. So this is the core problem, and the question is, to what extent are they substitutable? Substitutable in the short term, substitutable in the long term, and as we see it, I mean, coal can be substituted rather easily, and also on the short term, more difficult on the oil side, and even more difficult than on the gas side. And we see adaptation strategies across sectors. On the production sector, where companies still depend heavily on gas and are now thinking about how to change their manufacturing processes and how to substitute gas for other sources of energy. We see consumption patterns changing on the individual basis. I mean, this is also something that all, and I think Sergei mentioned it, that everybody can contribute to it, to change consumption patterns and energy consumption on the individual level. So substitutable and adaptability is the core issue right now. And I mean, if you move forward, we're talking about full embargo on fossil energy, I think we will see much more heterogeneity between EU member states. And I mean, there are calculations on what it would be costly, how costly it would be for Germany, a full ban, calculations between 0.5 to 3% of GDP losses, which is still significantly below what COVID-19 has created as cost, but it would be significant. And some manufacturing processes, especially in the chemical industry and the car manufacturing, would suffer a lot from a full embargo. Now, this is one issue, obviously. The other issues are the soaring prices, oil, gas prices, commodity, aluminium, nickel, but also corn and wheat. I mean, all the prices are going up. And we have already had supply side constraints during COVID-19, and now we have another supply side shock and inflation on the rise, impacting heavily not only the industry competitiveness, but also, of course, the social effects. And in my opinion, these are a main driver for reluctance, especially in Germany, but also in other countries, to not pursue a full embargo at this stage, because inflation would be persistent then. And I mean, it's not only oil and gas, as I said, but also corn, wheat, so other main consumption goods which would be affected. And then, of course, we also have to be aware what the monetary policy reacts. The ECB will reconvene today and make its stance today. So the monetary policy reaction to this inflation is a major impact, a major issue. Now, secondly, briefly on further sanctions. I mean, you have already mentioned, and it must be scalable. Ideally, we would hit those that are individually associated with the regime and minimize costs for the Russians. It's not a Russian war, as Sergei said, but it's a Putin war. And so Russians minimize impacts on the EU. And on that front, I wonder if you really, Michael, if we really exploited already all that we can in the sense of targeting oligarchs. I'm surprised or not surprised, but I think what is still missing is more transparency and disclosure on the wealth and assets of oligarchs. And we still don't know how much and to what extent they own assets and property in the European Union, but also in offshore. And looking at the Council regulation that was dealing with this, it was only required credit institutions to report deposits of above 100,000 euros by Russian oligarchs, but not on property, not on wealth, not on assets. So I wonder why only looking at deposits, why not making it transparent property more general of Russian oligarchs? Second, are we sure that we have sufficiently updated the anti-money laundering tools? I mean, the Financial Action Task Force, it's a global organization engaged in anti-money laundering, has just put the United Arab Emirates on the grey list. And because many oligarchs are shifting their wealth to the United Arab Emirates. But what about the EU list of non-cooperative countries? I mean, the EU list should also then be updated, in my view, and that would allow the EU member states effectively pursue with their anti-laundering tools. That on the targeted side, then only a few more lower hanging fruit to Russia or broader sanctions. ports for Russian shipping, similar to airport and airspace. Shutting down ports would be much more detrimental, obviously, to the European Union and to member states, because ships are typically not run by one Russian company, but by many international companies. So the detrimental effect of shutting down ports would be quite significant. First, second, what about extraterritorial, secondary sanctions? This is a tool that the US has been exploiting quite a lot already in former episodes of sanctions concerning Iran, for example. It basically means that you don't only sanction in a bilateral relationship, but you also sanction other countries continuing trade with a sanctioned country. Yeah, so and this, of course, that would practically mean that we would sanction China for doing on goods that we sanction in the relationship to Russia, to the extent that they also use European components. And I mean, this would be definitely would extremely increase the pressure on Russia, but at what price? I mean, the price of a trade war with non-concerned countries would be the consequence. I will leave it here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Extremely practical and actionable and useful as always. Thank you very much. We have now Sergei Fusa, who is working with Dragon Capital, which is a leading Ukrainian investment bank, and he's going to think a little bit forward about what would be the ideas for further things that we could be doing now. Go ahead, Mr. Fusa.
Hello, it's a great honor for me to be on this panel, and really great honor for me to speak after such a significant person in the economy. Sorry I can't be so elegant as you guys, but last 2 weeks I have no real free time for it, or maybe you could say that last 2 weeks was worst in our lives here. That's why maybe we try to push sanctions, because we want to stop it. Because we want to come back to our friends who are hoping alive, and we want to come back to our lives. Yes, I would like you to increase sanction pressure, and I do understand that it sometimes costs. What I really think you should understand, what should be the target of the sanctions? What possible result would stop Putin from bombing Ukraine? It's his fear. Only one thing we should focus on, it's Putin's fear. Fear of what? Fear of regime change. So the possible, most expectable result of sanctions should be regime change. And if Putin will be afraid of it, he will stop the war, or we will see regime change. That's why, yes, I heard a lot from previous speakers that it's very costly for European business. I do understand. Because we are now working in investment banks, and we know we can't count money. But Turkey responding such a way of thinking, I would like to see two different options. First option, implementing harder sanctions now and see the result in a few months as coming back to not business as usual, because after all this canceling Russia, business as usual is impossible, but to coming back to a situation when you can't trade with Russia. And for European business, it's much more pleasant situation that what we'll see if Putin would stop. Yes, we could implement now harder sanctions and see the result. Or you will implement, like European Union, sanctions in terms of few months and 1 year, and business will struggle. And with Putin in charge, with Putin with such a behavior, business will stop for years. And it's much more costly than if you will implement sanctions right now. I do understand, again, that I'm just asking because I need it. But from my point of view, it's quite logical. So maybe the most important sanction that we ask is ban or have a limit Russian export. What Sergei Guriev already mentioned, it would form their budget. And it's not only oil and gas. I think that Russia can export items collectively represent 90% of commodity export, whereas oil and oil product, gas, metals, chemical products, machinery, and precious stone metals. So it's all from the budget, and if you will destroy this budget, Putin will understand that his regime could be changed. Maybe some associated idea payments to Russian porters could be delayed or to reduce liquidity. It's one of the ways to not destroy export, to not destroy European economy, but to implement costs for Russia. So the key idea what we're asking for is limited Russian ability and to increase Putin's fear. Another thing that could minimize not minimize. I think there is a lot of loopholes now that minimize effect on Russian elite. And again, we focus on elite to make Putin's fear great. We all have seen how often now Abramovich plane was drifting around London to Dubai, London to Dubai. And yes, today was Britain implemented sanctions against Abramovich, but still he had a week. He had a week to transfer something from London to Dubai 2 times per day. And we understand that a lot of Russian elites will use these loopholes. And I think if they understand that they have these loopholes, their pressure on Putin and Putin's fear will be much limited. So close these loopholes is very, very important. And maybe we're talking now. We ask for European Union, for US, political pressure to countries such as United Arab Emirates or Dubai, that all others that well known as tax havens, to stop Russia and to use these loopholes. Another thing that all sanctions should equally be applied to Belarus, because Belarus is taking part in this aggression. The rockets flying from Belarus to Ukrainian cities, but also Belarus could use as loopholes. Well known for the last 8 years, it was loophole for transferring some food to Russia. Yes, it's one of the examples how it works. And I think now Belarus has a loophole for avoiding sanctions for oligarchs and for Russian elites. Another thing that I could call, yes, I will limit it. Another stuff that is very important for me is banking sanctions. And currently we see that SWIFT, it's not really working. Yes, it doesn't work at all. So banking sanction is good, but what we ask for is to increase SDM for whole banking system, especially for Sberbank. Because now the biggest bank of Russia, Sberbank, avoiding major sanctions, and from European Union and from US guys. And it helps the Russian economy to stay as it is. Yes, it's a game brief mentioned, but they still could have a mirage that things will go okay in a few months, and now they have just a shock. So I think it's major topics that I could mention that would be very helpful for me, for people of Ukraine, and for European economy also to come back to quasi-normal times in a process. That's all.
So I have to pass the baton to my colleague and fellow MEP, Petros, who's been leading all the efforts of the group on this matter, and they mentioned solidarity with Ukraine. Petros, if you allow me, the first question that I would ask, but that you allow to take it from there, is to Michael. There are two questions to Michael Karnitzev. That I think are very, very important. One has to do with the secondary sanctions, and the second has to do with so in particular we talk about Abu Dhabi and Dubai and the Arab Emirates and what's being done to avoid people avoiding the sanctions. And the other is, of course, the oil and gas that comes up every time, and that to me seems like the most relevant loophole right now. So those are two loopholes. But I leave Petros. I have to fly. I'll be hearing it on the speaker, but I will have to go in. Thanks very, very much, Petros. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you for a great introduction of speakers and all speakers present. May I start presenting questions, from the top down to Mikhail Karnichek, who made very clear that there might be some risks for the West to hit a recession. Mikhail, may you elaborate a little bit more? What are the real risks for kind of slowing down of growth on the Western side of economies? And so how do you estimate, well, in terms of percentage, how much it might hit, seeing the sanctions policy is developing. It's moving. It's a moving target. And I'm sure, we will have the second and following sanctions package, as, for example, the European Council is meeting later today to make further decisions in this regard. And would you be willing to elaborate a bit more on the impact of technological impact on the Russian economy? Because Russia is so dependent on high-tech technologies being exported to Russia, and it might be very immediate effect on the Russian economy. With these two questions, may we start Q&A session starting from first Mikhail Karnichek. Sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Now it works. Thank you very much. And thank you for this extremely useful debate. A couple of things. First of all, the elephant in the room, let's be very clear about this, is the energy sector. Precisely, and I will be extremely blunt, both for a Commission official and an Austrian citizen, precisely because our dependency on Russia over the last 5 to 10 years has actually grown and not been reduced. If you look at not only gas, but if you look at the import of coal and other commodities, the exposure that we have and the increase, the relative increase in the exposure is actually breathtaking. Again, to put it very undiplomatically, if you are already reliant on a very difficult dealer of your recreational drugs of choice, you do all sorts of stuff, but you try not to increase that dependency. That's what being semi-normal people would think. But apparently we're not in such a situation. You may have seen that the day before yesterday, the European Commission proposed some very, very far-reaching things, which I think a year ago would have been politically impossible, like so many things these days, to wean ourselves off that dependency. Again, the proof of the pudding will be in the implementation. There are no easy fixes. There are no overnight silver bullets. There are also, by the way, demand side bullets, but we need to work on infrastructure. We need to work on the regulatory environment. We need to work on etc. And as Professor Steinbach rightly, we shouldn't forget one thing. There is no red button here somewhere underneath my table where I could stop deliveries on one side and increase deliveries on the other side. We're talking about individual consumption patterns here. So in a way, foreign policy starts at quite literally at the gas station. But still, I'm confident that we can do this, because what has been forgotten too often is, first of all, we need to differentiate very strongly between different commodities. The big issue is gas, and even for gas, Russia is dependent on us. You just have to look at a simplistic map of the Russian pipeline network to understand that gas is not something that you blow into a shopping bag to China on the Trans-Siberian. It doesn't work like this. very obvious reasons. I'm not even speaking about the price structures, etc. So I think a very, very clear European posture on this is required. We have started it. I'm sure the leaders will discuss it at Versailles, of all places, tonight. And again, despite all issues that we face, we are in a different place also in that subsector of the sanctions debate than we were even a couple of weeks ago, where especially in one big member state, a cow after the other is slaughtered. Related to that, Sergei Fursa made a very important point about banks. That energy, let's say, psychological / economic issue filters through into our sanctions in the banking sector because there is a very serious concern. Let's face it, an understandable concern in some member states that an all-out blow against the Russian banking sector would lead to supply-side issues on notably the gas side already. The same thing, I think Professor Steinbach asked the question, relates to ports. One of the reasons why we have not yet banned Russian-flagged or owned vessels from EU ports is that we would precisely get an LNG / coal issue. So we need to think these issues through, apart from the fact that it is too easy to reflag a currently Russian registered vessel. On the other questions on secondary sanctions and circumvention measures, in a way, our sanctions, in particular in the financial sector, already have a de facto extraterritorial effect. I mean, let's face it, if you are and it's quite interesting to see what's happening in East Asia, by the way, if you are a financial institution in Singapore or Japan or Korea, you are going to be very, very careful to be in compliance with EU restrictive measures. And you will not take the risk of exposing yourself in your European operations. So we do see this sort of secondary wave already, not just in commodity markets, not just in technology markets, where we have a clear competitive advantage and therefore are in a position to hit Russia very hard, but also in the financial sector. On the circumvention, yes, we're raising this. We're closing all sorts of loopholes, also with third countries. I mean, this is the biggest sort of economic / diplomatic operation that's been ongoing for a while. The External Action Service is literally in the antechambers of finance ministries across the world to make sure that the secondary effect is there. A last word on oligarchs. As I said in my intro, yes, we see this as a key component of sanctions packages because it affects the ruling elite in Russia. And we will continue to do that. We will continue these listings. However, there are two things that I would ask you to consider. First of all, we have just recently, literally these days, enlarged the listing criteria. Before that, we here in Brussels had to prove that person X about to be listed was somehow involved or at least benefiting from Russia's assault against the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Now we have, fortunately, a broader definition, so we can act against people who are economically involved with the powers that be without necessarily having this Ukraine linkage. But it's difficult. Let's face it, people go to court against our sanctions. The first ones who are going to court, by the way, I find this hilarious, if it weren't so sad, is Russia today. So much for their interest in the rule of law, whom we have taken off the air. So we have to be, in other words, we have to be extremely circumspect about what we do regarding oligarchs, but also here, the last word has not been spoken. A final quick point, just to clarify one issue that Professor Steinbach mentioned. The 100,000 deposit is what we call the mini-garch rule. So it's below those people who are under a full asset freeze. You know, Russians are normally perfectly legitimately parking there abroad, who stored it the European Union in our banks, and that's what we don't want anymore. The 100K rule was developed in cooperation with the banks because they said this is what they can control best to debate how many people we catch with this. But this is a level below the oligarchs. So the oligarchs are hit by a complete asset and transaction freeze, and I think it's starting to work. I said the season freeze task force is operational, and I'm sure a couple more yachts in the weeks to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. And may I ask Sergei Guriev a question as we know that Russian Federation is a very vast, huge country. So what regions of Russia might be mostly affected by taking the Western sanctions? Because the prosperity level in the Russian Federation is very uneven. I mean, we see two cities like major ones like St. Petersburg and Moscow, and then probably the rest of Russia. I mean, what take looking at the regional impact of those sanctions? And secondly, did you notice any general tendency in consumer behavior of Russians? I mean, we saw many cars probably lining up to have last McDonald's, lunch or dinner, as well as high-brand shops were simply looted by consumers in Moscow and bigger cities. So what's, how there is the societal response? I mean, looking at the consumer's response, I mean, are there any special, any tendencies we have to notice for the time of being as Russians, ordinary Russian consumers respond to sanctions? Sergei.
Thank you, Petros. It's very hard to judge how the regional impact will evolve, because this is an unprecedented situation, and new sanctions are introduced every day, as well as the Russian government response. Also, new companies exit Russia every day. And so this is a massive shock, which we've not seen before, and so it's very hard to predict this impact. What I can say is everybody's going to be affected, and the relative effect will be dependent on how Russian government supports some of those most vulnerable. But just everybody will be affected. There are rich regions that export oil. They will suffer from the fact that Russian oil now is very hard to sell. Well, it's easy to sell, but it's very hard to get paid. So it's very hard to deliver because of transportation companies boycotting Russia. Most in St. Petersburg, the middle class has lost its quality of life, its lifestyle. Poorer regions will suffer from higher food prices and medicine prices. That impact will not disappear. And then there will be also an effect of spillovers of refugees. Of course, most of the refugees, the vast majority, the 99% of refugees will go to Europe. But there's still about 60,000 refugees which are now supposed to be in Russia. And that is also a big spillover. So every part of Russia will be affected. It's very hard to say which ones are going to be affected more. And again, the nature of this change may be hard to compare, because if you are a very rich Russian and you lose 80% of your assets, which may be rich Russian, you're still a rich Russian. You used to be a billionaire, but you're still a rich Russian. Now, if you have income which is just enough to pay for food and medicine, and inflation reduces the purchasing power of your income by 20%. It's just 20%, but it makes your life impossible. So these issues are very painful, very hard to talk about them in rational terms. Now, if you look at consumer behavior, well, consumers are extremely unhappy, but there is no way to manifest their discontent. And it's not, I think talking about McDonald's or Louis Vuitton, I think it's, the more important thing is people trying to save their savings. This is what people are trying to protect. And they will not do. because Russian central bank already said that, sorry, if you have a ruble account, it will be hit by inflation. Will offer you higher interest rates, but Russians understand that eventually that may result in freezing the accounts or even higher inflation. And then if you have currency accounts, you can only take $10,000. Everything above $10,000 will be paid to you in dollars. So this is the main worry, and the lines to ATMs, the lines to banks, these are the really important ones. If you ask me what would happen if, for example, a big bank freezes the deposit, if you asked me just a couple of years ago, I would say it would be a great revolt. So Sergey was talking about Sberbank, for example. If Sberbank doesn't allow free withdrawal of deposits, that should be a riot. However, today, Russia is a very different regime. The investment and repression apparatus has been really substantial, and so Russians are afraid to demonstrate. So in that sense, these lines reflect a lot of unhappiness, but this unhappiness will not result in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Stenbach, I ask you the following question. For the time of being, around 40 countries or so, probably more than 40 countries have introduced bigger or smaller, more limited sanctions against the Russian Federation and Belarus. Do you see any tendency that the club of those countries, imposing sanctions against two aggressive states might increase, or we will see, kind of the world divided into two camps, and with something in between. Probably something in between might be the biggest part of the world community. How you would assess this tendency?
Well, these two worlds, the big world on one side and the small world on the other side, we saw it in the Security Council of the United Nations, with most countries, in the General Assembly of the United Nations, most countries supporting the resolution condemning the Russian invasion. A few, 4 or 5 countries opposing it, and a couple more abstenting from vote. This is clearly the situation in which we are, and China and India being those countries that have no clear stance on sanctions, and potentially benefiting from redirecting flows, economic flows, financial flows away from EU and the US towards China and India, and therefore it's important to discuss how we deal with these countries. And ideally, somebody mentioned that the role of China is decisive here, and ideally, countries on our side, and with each day of atrocities occurring in Ukraine, my hope grows that these countries will at some point change their mind. But in that context, I would like to address two remarks that Michael made. It's true, we are in the episode of slaughtering sacred cows, which is a good thing. That is always what happens in crisis, and we see Germany exporting weapons to Ukraine. We see Germany taking 100 billion in order to finance its defense. And another sacred cow may be what you rightly identified as the core issue here is the energy independence issue. And with Germany phasing out both nuclear energy and coal by 2035, this is clearly running against energy independence. No, we all know that we are also living in the world of CO2 reduction, and this is also the other societal goal that we have to pursue. But on that front, on the energy policy mix, Europe is hugely divided, right? Look at the discussion that we had on the taxonomy, where nuclear energy was recognized as clean. which is outrageous from the German perspective. But I mean, on the energy policy side, we need more uniformity, and it correlates with the energy independence issue. And as you said, on that side today and tomorrow, maybe there will be some movement forward. Second remark on the oligarchs. I mean, there are estimations that 10 to 20,000 oligarchs living abroad, outside from Russia, and holding a huge, massive amount of assets. And on the list right now, I don't know how many, a couple of hundreds, maybe. Yeah. So the question is how to extend it. And Michael rightly said, I mean, there are also legal barriers to easily expand this list. And I don't want to bother you with the legal issues, but it's true that an individual can contest being on that list. Yeah, and can go to the European Court of Justice and just say, well, I didn't support the Russian regime, and the European Court of Justice then has to look into whether there are ties between them. And there's a famous case on Rosneft. After the invasion of into Crimea, there were already sanctions. Rosneft tackled being sanctioned, and in that case the European Court of Justice said, well, that's fine because Rosneft is state-owned. It's an obvious case where they can sit on this list, but it's less obvious for people where the association with the Russian regime are less so. So it's true, we cannot easily put every oligarch on that list, but I think the definitions that we put in the Council decisions and the Council regulation applying to those benefiting from the Russian regime, I mean, this should be extensively applied and interpreted. And it comes with certain legal risk, but I think in the current situation, you should accept certain legal risks. And in order to increase pressure, so you have to weigh legal security versus pressure on Russia, and I think in the current situation, the pressure on Russia is more important.
Professor Stenbeck, I mean, you made some remarks on energy policy and Green Deal. Today in the European Parliament, we are to vote on some gas projects. All right, I mean, should the European Union support and finance missing links in the, for example, gas infrastructure? And I can tell you, even my group, Renew Europe, is very divided. Some said, well, I mean, no way, we have to go for a Green Deal, we have to refuse any attempt to prolong and even increase gas consumption, as other group of my colleagues saying, look, I mean, we have a different security situation. We will use gas still for some time, and there is no, well-united, coordinated, efficient gas network in Europe, and some links are essentially important. So with this in mind, I mean, Professor Stenbeck and probably other colleagues, I mean, what is your take on Green Deal? I mean, what should we do differently probably now in order to speed up our energy independence and still be resilient to any energy shocks or external shocks on especially EU energy market?
Yeah, maybe I can start very briefly. The obvious and easy answer, I mean, there are easy answers and difficult answers. And one of the easy answers, which is also politically easy to communicate, is now, if not now, we have to accelerate expansion of renewable energies, right? This is one of the easy messages that comes from this. Renewable energies are liberty energies because they make us independent to the extent that we extend solar and wind production in the EU. Well, this is the easy part of the side. The more difficult is we move to other technologies, such as bridging technologies, such as nuclear or gas. I mean, as you know, gas has been seen as a bridging technology to the array of renewable energies because it's flexible and it can compensate the volatility of renewable energies.
now with the new situation, of course, this has to be put all on the table again, including nuclear energy. And the discussions of the German government with the nuclear power plants is ongoing. But I mean, the message so far is by nuclear plants, is by the companies, is that if they would now prolong the production in Germany, which is to be phased out by now, they would do so only on a viable basis if they could do so for 5 or 6 more years. And then you know better than me that there are political issues involved of those who don't want that. Last point, I mean, obviously, and Michael is better placed to talk about this. I mean, the EU has now to reinforce its effort to import renewable energy from elsewhere. I mean, Desertec was an initiative in Africa 10 years ago, and it failed. Yeah, there was a big plan of producing solar energy in Morocco and the Mediterranean countries, in the Maghreb countries in Africa, but it failed. And I mean, with this new situation of cutting links to Russia, we have to reinvent our external energy policy. Thank you. Anybody else, I mean, who wants, to contribute on this? No. All right. So then, I have a question to Sergei Furset. Ukraine and Russia are two major grain producers, as well as corn producers in the world. With the military action taking big territories of Ukraine, Russian part is not taken. I mean, I would really ask you, to come with some comments. What kind of impact of Ukraine's agriculture and potential of exports of grain we might see? I tell you frankly, there is a lot of talks in the European Parliament about the impact on the foodstuff market. Expectations are, and we see, the grain prices skyrocketed, recently. So if Ukraine is not part of the international grain markets because of known reasons, what the kind of the impact on Ukraine's economy it might have, and probably on the international market in general. Sergei, I would appreciate your comment.
Now it's very hard to talk about the influence on Ukrainian economy because due to calculation of national banks, National Bank of Ukraine, we lost about 50% of GDP day per day. So every day we lost 50% of this day GDP. So I think agricultural impact is important. It helps now that it's winter and the season is not started. But the total influence for Ukrainian economy is very damaging, especially taking into account that a lot of people are becoming refugees and moving to Poland, to Czech Republic, to Slovakia. Yeah, often it's very active people. So we got huge influence, and one of the influence It's very important that last year we got record harvest, but this record harvest are in terminals now. It's inside, in elevators inside Ukraine, and it can't be exported till the war is going on because every port is blocked. And I don't expect that we got huge capabilities for export by trains, for instance. So first effect is that Ukrainian agribusiness are now struggling, and you could have huge, but if you don't export it, sorry, you're lost in money. On the other hand, and now we're talking about effect for it's not only Ukrainian agribusiness, but also huge impact on world prices. In south about this year due to La Nina, and as far as we know, we even could expect some deficit. Maybe it helps us, it gives us some hope that China will influence on Russia, because Ukrainian corn was and used to be very important for the Chinese market. And I don't think the Chinese are now very happy seeing how it was going. Yes, they were about war, but they were expected 2 days of something and business as usual. But now it's impossible, and I hope China will influence, because if the season wouldn't start, start of agriculture season in Ukraine, maybe the end of March, start of April, it already will have huge impact for next harvest and already next year. So currently we have problems with exporting last year's harvest, and the impact of food prices all over the world and food security all over the world for this year, for next maybe 5-6 months. If the war will continue, and impact of Ukrainian economy, yes, will continue. So Ukrainian agribusinesses will continue, but it also will destroy harvest of this year. So what we would export in 2023, and this also could lead to like huge humanitarian crisis, but all over the world, not only in Ukraine.
Thank you, Sergey. I mean, stepping more on this possible humanitarian crisis, I received one question online. A person asks about impacts of sanctions on oncology, meaning fighting cancer. And the question goes as reports are coming about lack of raw materials to produce necessary medicine to fight cancer. Access to foreign treatment is blocked, mainly probably for Russian patients, potentially for it. And donations, which are sometimes important for hospitals and research and development, again, on decrease. So the question stands, should the European Union impose some or have exceptions for some types of transactions policy line to that very humanitarian aspect? I ask everybody of you, what do you think of this? And how to do it? Anybody who wishes to start? Humanitarian aspect of drugs so needed to fight cancer. And probably it relates to patients from Russia, from Belarus, probably, but that's an important aspect as well. What if it's a question from the audience we received?
Well, maybe I can come in on this. Of course, have humanitarian exceptions in our various sanctions regulations. We have precisely thought about this also when it comes, by the way, for not just the actual drugs that are being exported, but the raw materials or equipment, appliances that are used in that industry. In our new export control regime, there are exceptions for that. The question is, of course, always, are we able to delimit that particular export needed for humanitarian or medical reasons, or is there a broader background? That is always the challenge that we have, or that rather our member states' authorities have in the enforcement of that. But in principle, it is still possible. Let's not forget that we have export and import bans right now only on very specific items and not across the board.
Thank you. Anybody else? No. All right. We have remaining 10 or so minutes. I'm looking for Luis. Is Luis still with us? Luis? No, doesn't look so. Probably he left because of other businesses. Today we had a meeting with the 8 members of European Parliament. Ukrainian Parliament, Verkhovna Rada. Those ladies, women came to the European Parliament in Strasbourg, and some of them, they spent almost 4 days traveling from Ukraine to Strasbourg. I shouldn't tell you, in the emotional state of our Ukrainian colleagues, everything is clear. Some of them came with children because they had nobody to leave those children with. Father and grandfather are fighting aggressor. So situation as clear. They plead to us for more sanctions, for more humanitarian economic support, for more financial support, political support, nothing to speak. And I mean, they spoke, one voice, one very strong voice of more solidarity and more support with Ukraine as it stands. So may I ask you, starting maybe from Michael, to sum up our discussion, how you would ask the European and Western, as well as like-minded politicians, governments, to do something more. I mean, with sanctions, economic sanctions, economic regimes imposed on aggressor states in order to, to bring more peace and stability to Ukraine. I mean, it's the most important issue now, because we can't see those, falling above 500 kilos on schools and hospitals in Ukraine. It's simply insane. It's absolutely unacceptable. So what would be your message to the Western politicians and decision makers who are meeting today in Versailles and in other capitals in order to, deter and solve this issue? Please, gentlemen, you have each of you at least 2 minutes.
Well, then I will start. I mean, let me say by one thing. I mean, nothing we can do, at least on my little bureaucratic level, can of course compare to the unspeakable human suffering that Ukraine goes through, but also the enormous I would even say heroic fight that this country is putting up. And I think if we look back at the last 2 weeks, this may sound very strange to all of you, but this should actually be a cause for optimism, because one thing is clear: this is not going as some people in Moscow had planned it, and that is in itself a good sign. And secondly, we have the necessary building blocks to President von der Leyen for her appearance tonight at the summit on all fronts, that we're prepared to go much further on sanctions. But again, don't forget, these sanctions are adopted unanimously by member states, so we need to see what the market can bear. But given that we have already come very far, I would expect this trend towards serious, very significant, hard-hitting sanctions to continue. Secondly, we are, of course, also upgrading our humanitarian aid. You have seen that we have, for the first time ever, activated the temporary protection directive, meaning millions of refugees and displaced Ukrainians can come into the European Union. We're also backing this up financially, also with extra macroeconomic aid, etc. We are buying, the European Union member states are buying arms for Ukraine. Let's not forget this. We are in a completely different security and economic policy environment than we were even 2 or 3 months ago. So we will continue this. Our solidarity is completely unwavering, and I think every day that passes, I can say from here from the Brussels bubble, every day that passes is a day in which this solidarity grows further across the European Union, doesn't it?
Thank you, Professor Guriev.
Yes, I will. Repeat what I just said. I think sanctions so far have been unprecedented, demonstrated historically not seen unity among the countries in the anti-Putin coalition, but it's still not enough to stop the war now. Sanctions have destroyed the Russian economy, but Putin still has money to fund the war. And I would say one thing as a scholar of non-democratic regime, information matters. Informational war is very important. And for obvious reasons, Ukraine is winning information war everywhere except within Russia. But that also means we may overestimate the Ukrainian successes so far. Ukrainians fought bravely, but that doesn't have to convince us that that's been enough. Russian troops are stuck, but they may regroup and the war may continue. It's critical to increase pressure on Mr. Putin and deprive him of financial resources. And that means both revenues in China. Whatever can be done to make sure that Mr. Putin is deprived of money to pay his soldiers as well as his policemen within Russia, the more the better.
Thank you, Professor Guriev. Professor Steinbach, your last statements.
Yes, I agree on the sanction side, and I would add two more observations. I mean, give my view that extending sanctions is a function of support in EU member states. Only if there's sufficient support, social and economic and political support, we can extend sanctions. And this calls for an active state, redistributional state in EU member states. So the damage that individuals and companies suffer in the EU from sanctions must be compensated, or at least partially compensated, must be softened. And therefore, it's not only an outward looking, the sanction regime, it's also inward looking. And I mean, what does that mean? I mean, inflation is always unsocial. And I mean, in the inflation, lowest income groups most, and therefore, in terms of heating costs, in terms of consumption costs, etc. So we need in EU member states safeguard mechanism, compensation schemes for on an individual level. We need compensation schemes also for companies. I mean, right now, a gas supplier, a gas importer, has contracts with Russia over 15 years, and if he cancels this contract, he's subject to litigation and to legal claims. So if he cancels this supply contracts, he must be compensated by EU member states or by the national government if he does so. So we need a redistributive element inward looking. First point. Second point, I would not only address policy level. I mean, what has this crisis in common with COVID, that it society as a whole, and all elements, all levels of society can contribute. I mean, we were talking about how to adapt to having less gas imports or oil imports. Companies must restructure their manufacturing processes, and individuals must adapt their consumption behavior. So it's not only addressing and asking governments to act, but also ourselves, both as an individual and as a part of subjects of the economy. That is my last statement.
Thank you, Professor. Sergei Fursan. Sir.
Again, thank you for the opportunity to communicate in a way it's now impossible. And maybe I want to think that we used to think that European Union is based on values. And these values are coming back to Rousseau, Voltaire, etc., times. And I think that Europeans should understand that Ukrainians now are fighting just for the same values, to protect freedom, not only the freedom of Ukraine and homes of Ukraine, but because of freedom of all Europe. Because you should understand that when such regime starts, when what you see now is born in Russia, it never stops. We have seen it a number of times in history. If Putin wouldn't be stopped in Ukraine, he will move forward. And it will be already about values, material values in Europe, because when he bombs your cities, he destroys much more than cost of sanctions could be. So this solidarity we really need, and it's all about people's lives and about people's values and about future, because future of Europe could be not very good if Putin will move forward.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, let me, on behalf of all of you, most kindly to thank Mikhail Karnichink, Sergei Guriev, Arvin Steinbach, and Sergei Fursa for excellent exchange, short but very excellent exchange. We've been given a lot of comprehensive information about the economic sanctions, present and possible future impact on different economies and possible new regulatory regimes in the world in order to tackle today's problem. You know, I mean, many people all of a sudden in Europe started to recall that the European Union was created to ensure peace after the World War II. I mean, so simple. I mean, it sounds so simple and clear, but it's not much. I mean, to remind ourselves that we have to do everything possible to support Ukraine in the face of this brutal, aggressive aggression from Russia in support of Belarus. Stop aggressor, bring peace to Ukraine, and bring Ukraine to the European Union as much as possible. Probably this is the second part of our tasks, which must be, used as much as possible. I hope the audience was given a very clear information on the issue we've been debating today.